for joining us today. The Chancellor, Rishi Sunak, made his budget statement yesterday against a backdrop of a stronger than expected post-COVID domestic economy. But as we all know, there are challenging months ahead, with cost of living increases for all households. What was perhaps surprising yesterday was that there was no mention of the social sector and the contribution it makes. Well, we intend to rectify that today in our session where we'll explore what the budget and the spending review might mean for the UK's social sector. We're going to start with the PBE's Chief Executive, Matt Whitaker, who will reflect on the key economic data contained in yesterday's report, which will provide some context for our discussion today. Matt became Chief Executive of Pro Bono Economics in November 2019, after 11 years at the Living Standards think tank, the Resolution Foundation. Then we'll hear from Richard Sagar, Policy Manager at Charity Finance Group, on what this spending review means for charities and their finances. Finally, Sian Williams, Director of the anti-poverty charity Toynbee Hall, will give us her view on what it all means for the people that charities serve. After this, there'll be an opportunity to put your questions to our expert panel. As I mentioned, please do use the chat window on your right-hand side to leave all your questions and comments. Now, without further ado, let's go over to Matt to give us an overview of what was announced yesterday.
Many thanks, Nicola, and good morning, everyone. I'm going to share my screen so that you have some slides. There you go. As Nicola mentioned, I used to work at Resolution Foundation for a number of years, and we were reminiscing just backstage before we came on about various horror shows around fiscal events. And in the old days, I would have been presenting stuff like this at about 8 o'clock in the morning, having had no sleep the night before whatsoever. So the chance to do this at 10 a.m. from the comfort of my own home is sheer luxury, which I could definitely get used to, and helped, I should say as well, by the fact that actually I didn't have to get that involved yesterday. The team at PBE, I must thank them for all their hard work, because they were on it from the word go, turned around an excellent briefing, which you can see on our website. And it was a joy actually just for us all to be in the office and to have everybody pulling together. It was a bit like the old days, but less tricky for me. So that was very nice. So as Nicola says, my job is primarily to provide some context, to pick through the economic data, primarily that was in the OBR's report yesterday, as much as in the budget and in the spending review, to sort of set the scene, if you like, for other colleagues on the panel to go into a bit more detail and to talk about what it might mean more specifically for different parts of the charity sector. So in doing that, where do we start? We start with the fact that from the Chancellor's perspective, this was a very positive budget and spending review. He was very keen to emphasise the positives. This was a corner being turned. So the quotes here talk about preparing for a new economy, an economy fit for a new age of optimism, plan for growth, building a stronger economy for the British people. And he was helped in that by the fact that he'd already put in place tax rises, so he didn't have to sort of go over any of that yesterday, but they were giving him a lot of money. And then the OBR presented him with a lot more money that they found down the back of their sofa with the reforecast that they always go through ahead of these things. And instead of using that money to pull back on those tax rises which he'd already planned, he used that money in the main to spend more. So that meant that what yesterday ended up being was giveaway after giveaway. So there was a definite sense that this was a sort of a good moment for the nation, a good moment certainly for the Chancellor. But step back, and I think it's important to ask, how much of a corner have we actually turned? Because if you look at the economy overall, and I'll explain this chart, because if you can get your head around this one, you'll get your head around all the others, because they're all quite similar. So this chart is showing what has happened to GDP per capita since 2000. And the solid blue line gives you the actual outturn figures, the actual figures that the ONS has presented us with. And the various dotted lines give you the OBR projections at different stages of time. So you can see GDP growing from 2000 up to the financial crisis, falling very sharply after that, very slow and long recovery thereafter. And as we were just about to enter the pandemic in March 2020, the OBR presented its forecasts. which suggested we would just carry on very much on the same trajectory. As we all know, that didn't happen, and we had the huge drop in output, and then a fairly sharp rebound. And at March 2021, the projection from the OBR was that we'd actually sort of suffer a bit of a drop again, and then come back from that, and it would all be a bit slow and take quite a while to recover, and it'd be this W-shaped recovery. In fact, what's happened since then is the economy's outperformed what the OBR thought, and that's one of the reasons why there was the money down the back of the sofa for the Chancellor to spend yesterday. The pink line is then showing you the projection as of yesterday, and as you can see, it is for the recovery which we are now in to continue over the course of this year and next. But the scars will last, as the headline says, because even as we get back to a new normal, that new normal is on a lower trajectory than we were projected to be back in March 2020. So the pandemic will leave a scar on our economic growth. Nowhere near as large as the one from the financial crisis. That step change in trajectory that you see in 2008 is nowhere near that size, and it's smaller than we thought back in March. But nevertheless, we're not recovering the ground lost over the course of the pandemic. We're merely sort of moving back to a similar pace of growth, but at a slightly lower level, and that's important. Good news on jobs generally has been that's the good news on GDP has tended to feed through into good news on jobs. And in terms of, this chart is showing the unemployment rate, again, sort of same setup in terms of solid lines and dotted lines. And at the start of the pandemic, the projection was that unemployment was going to go through the roof for very obvious reasons. And even in March, the projection was, even with the furlough scheme in place, that unemployment would reach about 6.5%. Again, in practice, what's happened since then is unemployment has started coming down already. So it's ended up peaking at a much lower level than anyone was expecting. And that is because of the furlough scheme and because that scheme was extended a number of times. And if you look at the pink line, we are on course, according to the OBR, to get unemployment back down to more or less where it would have been in the projections ahead of the pandemic. A very slight increase, but more or less back down to where it was. But again, the nuance matters here, and what we're actually looking at in the near term is a pickup in unemployment again. So the furlough scheme is now over. There will be churn related to that. There will be some fallout. And so the expectation is that although unemployment has been falling over the course of this year, it will go back up again before it drops. And so for those people affected, and we're talking about a couple of 100,000 people here, that is not trivial. And that is an important thing, particularly for charities and people within the social sector. That points to a group of people that will need some extra support. So if the picture's a bit mixed on GDP and a bit mixed on unemployment, on cost of living, it's much clearer, which is there are cost of living pressures out there. They are building, and they are set to grow further. So this time the chart is showing you the rate of inflation, the CPI rate. And the big change really this time compared to the projections in March and the projections before the pandemic is that we are now expecting a big spike in inflation. So the official projection from the OBR here is that inflation reaches 4.4% sometime in spring next year, which is the highest level since 2011. Now, actually, they have to make their projections ahead of getting the final set of data on what's actually going on in the economy. And within the document yesterday, what they've actually said is, had they had the data that is now available, that line would have gone to 5% rather than 4.4%. So their official forecast is that inflation will reach 4.4%, but they actually think it will reach 5%, and that would be the highest level of inflation this century. That's relatively short-lived. We sort of move back towards something more normal, around 2% over the course of the next couple of years. But again, non-trivial, particularly for those being affected over the course of the next year and a half. Have material consequences for many people, I think. And actually, what it means overall, if you add all of that together, an improving picture on jobs, but a cost of living squeeze in terms of household incomes, which is ultimately the thing which determines how well off we all feel and how much spending we can do and all the rest of it. On this measure, there was actually a deterioration yesterday compared to where we were in March. So bucking the trend of what was going on generally with the forecast yesterday. So same sort of chart here, this time showing you household disposable income per person since 2000. See relatively steady increase through to the financial crisis, flatlining for several years after that, picking up again pre-pandemic, and as of March 2020, expectation was incomes would carry on climbing. As of March 2021, the expectation was that they would flatline for a bit and then start to pick up. As of yesterday, the expectation actually is over the next 12 months, they'll go down. So for all the boosterism in the Chancellor's speech yesterday, what he's actually presiding over here is potentially a year's worth of squeeze on incomes. So a living standard squeeze, which the longer that goes on, the harsher that will feel and the less easy it will be to sort of reconcile his tone with what people are actually feeling. And then as you start to get recovery from sort of this time next year, that's pretty slow recovery. And you're left with a gap between incomes projected for 2024, 2025, and what they would have been in the absence of the pandemic of £1,200 per person. So we will all be poorer by £1,200 on average relative to a world in which the pandemic hadn't happened. As, again, that will have material consequences that will feel very real for lots of people. And it will feel especially real, of course, for particular people. And we know from the pandemic that it is those on the lowest incomes who've been hit hardest by all sorts of consequences related to the pandemic. Actually, if you look at the tax and benefit changes that the Chancellor's brought in over the course of his fiscal statements in the last couple of years, it is actually progressive. So the biggest burden is falling on those with the highest incomes, despite the cut in universal credit, which has been much talked about, and it was a mistake, I think, not to reverse that. Overall, the burden that the Chancellor is putting on households to help with the public finances is falling a bit more heavily on those with higher incomes. But nevertheless, we know that if you're in the middle of a living standard squeeze, a cost of living squeeze, that is almost always going to fall most heavily on those on the lowest incomes. We know that the cuts that we're seeing in universal credit, the tax rises that are coming, will just be felt that much more heavily by those on lower incomes. And this chart is taken from the Bank of England from last year, which looks at what's happened to the levels of savings in households across the income distribution. So the lowest income households on the left, the highest income households on the right, and is ascertaining what balance of households expect or are reporting increases in savings versus decreases in savings. And you get that households on lower incomes are reporting that their savings have gone down over the course of the pandemic. Households in the top half reporting that their savings have gone up. And overall, the figure yesterday from the OBR is that because we weren't able to go out and spend in the way we normally would, we've got £170 billion worth of extra savings in our bank accounts right now compared to pre-pandemic. But it looks very much like that is not distributed very evenly at all. So for the lower income households facing a squeeze with balance sheets which have been damaged by the pandemic, that is much more difficult than for those higher income households who've actually built up some savings over the last couple of years. So these pressures hit some more than others, and I think it's fair to say it will be the usual sum. In terms of the public finances, a big boost yesterday to day-to-day spending, and a surprising one, bigger than people had expected. And yeah, I think we can now officially say, we've been saying it for a little while, but it's clear that the sort of era of austerity is over. Public spending, public services spending is on the rise, and consistently so. And as the Chancellor pointed out, across most, he said all, actually it's most departments. But clearly its shadow remains. So this chart is just showing the blue line in the middle is real RDEL, which is the technical name for basically day-to-day spending per person across all of government. And you can see since 2009, 2010, the big drop off through the austerity years started to turn the corner in about 2018. And the dotted line is there because through the pandemic, things have been all over the place, but it's the sort of the trend line, if you like. And what we've got, and through the spending review yesterday, is that spending is on the increase, particularly front loaded. So first year of the spending review in particular, spending is set to go up and then sort of modify a bit. But the red line is showing the protected departments, so health, education, aid, and one or two others. And there you see that through that period of austerity, they were indeed somewhat protected, and now again starting to grow. The green line is the unprotected departments. So it is the courts, the prisons, the local government, the Home Office, the DWP, all these sorts of departments. And there you can see the impact of austerity was just that much greater. Now, the good news is that line has also now turned the corner and is on its way back up again. But even by 24-25, expenditure in those departments is only 80% of what it was back in 2009-2010 per capita. So yes, austerity might be over, we might not be reducing budgets still further, but its shadow, I think, very clearly remains, and budgets remain stretched in many places. So against all of that backdrop, we know that charities will help. They've done that over the last 2 years in remarkable ways, and they will continue to do so. But elevated demand for charities at a time when they will, I think, still be facing reduced balance sheets. So I'm going to do a thought experiment here, which I will openly admit is not my most sophisticated bit of modelling ever, but is a sort of useful exercise, I think. So this time the line is showing household consumption, so what we spend on stuff. And running up to the start of the pandemic, similar shape to what we've seen on GDP and on income, increases up to the financial crisis, drops, and then starts to recover again. If we overlay charity income, this is from the NCVO Almanac figures, they match pretty closely. So this isn't levels, this is growth rates that match. Now we know, and we wrote a paper on this last year, that there's a lot going on under the bonnet here. You can't sort of say it's a one-to-one relationship. Different sources of charity income relate to different things. But nevertheless, overall, in the period since about 2006, these two measures match each other pretty closely. So probably quite interesting to see what's happening to household consumption as a way of starting to understand what might be happening with charity income. If the pandemic hadn't happened, it would just have carried on growing. Of course, that didn't happen. We know the big drop starts to return. As of yesterday, the projection is that things will continue to recover. The households will go out and start spending money again, but again, never quite meeting the trajectory or level rather that was in place ahead of the pandemic. So what does that mean? That means that if the charity income figure follows what's going on with household consumption, then you might expect the big drop, something of a recovery, but never quite getting back to where it was, leaving you with a permanent hole. Now, I think there's very good reasons for suggesting that income from foundations, income from government will not follow this trajectory. We know there's been emergency funding, we know people have stepped up. But funding from the public, particularly spending in charity shops and on events, probably will follow something similar to this. So if we just look at that element of charity income, then the whole that is implied by this trajectory is worth about £6.6 billion. So that's £6.6 billion of lost income over the course of the pandemic, which is just never recovered. So we get back to year-on-year growth in income, similar to what we saw pre-pandemic, but we never recover that lost ground. So we're doing more, but with less. And just as an aside on that, I said there's 170 billion of extra household savings out there. When the bank asked people who had an increase in savings, what are you going to do with it? This was the response, and they were able to give as many responses as they wanted. Most people keeping it in the bank account, which isn't very helpful for the economy, but that's sort of natural, I suppose. Some people spending it, paying off debts, deposits, various other things. There isn't actually an option for giving to charity, which in itself I think is quite revealing. We talked to the people at the bank, and their thought was, to the extent that it would exist anywhere, it would exist in the other category down at the bottom there. So 4% of people thinking they will do something else with the savings. So some portion of that might be giving it to charity, but it looks like this 170 billion savings windfall, not very much of it is going to find its way into charity coffers. So overall, just to end, what does that mean? I think it means that the charity sector in some ways ends up where it began. So the story of the pandemic, this is data taken from the Charity Tracker survey that we've been running over the course of the pandemic, is reduced income and increased demand for services. This sort of perfect storm, if you like, doing more with less. So Chancellor says things are on the up. Certainly some economic indicators out there which suggest we've turned a corner. But I think for the charity sector, maybe we've just come full circle, and the next year or two will be equally as tough as the last year or two. But I will leave that to my other panelists to opine on in more detail in their particular areas. Thank you.
Thanks, Matt. We'll now move over to Richard, who can give us his thoughts on what the implications are for charity finances from what the Chancellor had to say yesterday.
Thank you, Nicola. I'll just also share my slides briefly. Wonderful. Can people see that now? Just to confirm, can people see the slides? Is that okay? Okay, I'll take that as a yes. So it's worth mentioning at the outset that the criticism usually from the charity sector is that there's a lack of vision from government when it comes to funding charities. And instead, there are a handful of pots of money that are provided to politically expedient causes. So it could be to Veterans Affairs or children's charities, or the air ambulance has done well recently. It's fair to say that this budget, we didn't even get that. So I suppose be careful what you wish for. But we'll start with looking at the specific funding of charities in the budget where they mentioned. And as mentioned here, there was actually surprisingly little and perhaps disappointingly so. Perhaps the biggest benefit in terms of sector was the museum sector. And we'll come on to later a kind of tax relief they also got. But there were £52 million of new funding for museums and also cultural and sporting bodies as well. So that was of some benefit, certainly. And a small announcement on youth funding. This was expected, it should be said, alongside a commitment to the Youth Investment Fund, which has been in the offing for some time, and we're hoping to get further details on. And although this announcement isn't really additional funding for charities, it's the barrel I'm having to scrape given the lack of announcements, and it concerns Veterans Affairs and also funding support veterans, particularly mental health and others. And it's in collaboration with the Office of Veterans Affairs, Health and Social Care Department, and also the MOD. And that's just the quote there, is in collaboration with the charity sector where appropriate. We don't know how much of that money will go to them, but nonetheless, it is a mention which was not necessarily for other sectors as well.
Richard, can I just highlight? I don't think we're able to see your slides. I don't know what's happened there, but I certainly can't see them here. I don't know about other people.
Okay. Let me try and share again. Is that any better?
Well, I'm not. I don't think people can. Oh no, it's just come up now. It has just started. Yeah.
Okay, wonderful.
So just mentioning, yes, it's the surprisingly little slide on youth funding just popped up.
Wonderful, thank you. I'll move on to the next slide now, and that concerns the UK Shared Prosperity Fund. It was a fund announced to replace EU structural funding. It's been much delayed to the extent that the government had to introduce a new fund, the UK Renewal Fund of £220 million, which, funny enough, was also delayed. So it very much has been waiting for this for some time. But there's actually, I expect, disappointing news for many, in that the total amount of money that's been allocated until 2024-25 has been 2.6 billion. And when we compare that to what was given previously through the EU structural funds, it was just under 8 billion. So as mentioned here, it's hard to square that with the previous manifesto commitment that it would, at a minimum, match the size of those funds in each nation. It looks like a significant decline unless we see a real uptick beyond 2025, and we have no reason to do so. It's worth noting, and credit to PBE and others for this, of the UK SPF, a certain amount was allocated to the new Multiply 3-year plan to improve basic numeracy skills. Again, a real positive, helping people get back into work, but it's worth noting that it means 560 million will be taken away from that 2.6 billion as well. So there's even less funding for other causes. But again, credit to PBE for the analysis which led to that. When we look at tax, we're actually, again, a little disappointing. We were expecting to, or hoping to see a little more around amendments to gift aid and a little bit to VAT. We didn't see those. The only two real big changes to tax of relevance to the sector. Again, one concerns museums, and that was museums and galleries exhibition tax relief, which has been extended for a further 2 years, which is positive. And again, a sector that's been hit very hard by COVID, and also the increase in the headline rate. And these are reliefs for theatres and orchestras, respectively. There's going to be a temporary increase, as mentioned here, up until 2023. And again, it will start to taper back down in the years following. again, of some benefit, but for only small parts of the sector. And on business rates relief, the real positive here, I suppose, is not what did happen, but the promise of what won't happen. There'd been a concern for some time that the fundamental business rates review would lead to a fairly big change for business rates, and also might mean the end of the charitable rate relief, which is an 80% mandatory relief for charities and worth about 2 billion. Is in fact the largest tax relief that charities get, even larger than gift aid. So you can see how significant that is. And from the fundamental review, we got the following commitment that the government does not intend to remove any of the existing reliefs at this time. That's certainly a positive for charities and their finances, and means they can plan ahead, presuming that that relief will remain in place. So something positive there. There was also other announcements that were of some relevance. So the more frequent reevaluations, moving from 5 to 3 years, worth noting, but again, not going to fundamentally change charity finances at this time. I suppose real bad news was around international development. Perhaps not a surprise, unfortunately, but the decision was not taken to reverse the cut to ODA from 0.5. So it remains 0.5% of GNI for the foreseeable future. However, there was a commitment, kind of pathway of when that might end. And so if the fiscal tests that the Chancellor has previously set are met, it looks like it'll be by 2024-25, which was earlier than previously forecast. However, that's open to change. There's no certainty that it will return then. And there's another concern from many international development charities, and that's what's included within that 0.5% at the moment. And things like the COVID vaccine, debt relief, and also special drawing rights, which are, it's again, reserve currency issued by the IMF, is all counted against that budget. So it could actually mean cuts in the short term as well. So even more concerns, I think, for international development there. So yeah, a big announcement was around the Levelling Up Fund, and we've had the first round of projects funded. We've got a spreadsheet of 105 or so, which will be funded. More funding in the regions than expected, I suppose, in Scotland, Wales, and Northern Ireland. And actually, it means I think per head, there's greater funding for those regions than for England, of the 4.8 billion. But looking at the bids on first glance suggests that actually very little, if any of it, will go to social infrastructure. The majority will go to the things we feared it may go to. So that's obviously physical regeneration, lots on transport infrastructure, improving town centres. There are one or two organisations or places that did benefit with social infrastructure, but not nearly enough. And I know it's both a call from CFG and PB that greater investment going forward is made in social infrastructure alongside the physical infrastructure. This will be a theme I'll return to in 1 or 2 more slides, and that's the upcoming Levelling Up paper will be crucial in determining if there is further investment in social infrastructure, and also we'll hear more about the UK SBF in that paper as well. So really one to look out for. And again, a real small pot of money here, just £9 million for a parks fund, which is of some benefit again, but hardly a game changer for the sector. This is perhaps not the most pretty table I've ever produced, but nonetheless instructive. And it was by my colleague, Richard Hebditch, who's at the Association of Charity Foundations, which compares on the one hand what the social sector was calling for in our joint budget submission on the left-hand side, compared to what actually happened at the budget. So as you see on the Levelling Up Fund, it's suffice to say we didn't quite get what we want, or at least the decisions have been delayed until the Levelling Up white paper. So our calls were for greater spending on social infrastructure, as mentioned, and also a social infrastructure strategy to accompany that. And also that it's important that charities and community organisations should be included in the decision-making process rather than things done centrally. However, it looks like this will come true, and it may be determined centrally. For a long time, we've advocated for a community wealth fund alongside those at the local trusts and others, which creates a multi-billion-pound endowment from dormant assets. And again, we don't have further information at this stage on that, although we're hoping for some good news again in the upcoming white paper. On local government funding, although it was better than expected, and there was actually an increase in funding and many feared a cut, it still doesn't begin to undo the cuts that have happened over recent years, and we're still below 2010 levels in terms of local government funding. So that's a real concern for the sector, I think, and it's hard to know how that might translate both into grants for our members, but also what that means for beneficiaries as well. I think Matt touched on this briefly. I'm sure we'll hear more coming up, but the cuts to universal credit were not reversed. There was news around the taper, which was again more positive than expected, but doesn't begin to undo the damage that's been caused by that cut. I've touched on the UK SBF already, and again, we'll hope to hear further information further down the line. But again, the amounts of money haven't been sufficient to, or aren't what we'd hope they'd be. I've touched on international aid as well, and a slightly different ask here around the sixth carbon budget. Again, more money and revised remits, but not quite what we want to hear, and perhaps a surprising cut to air passenger duty for domestic flights, given we're in a climate crisis and we have the COP upcoming in Glasgow. One or two bits I want to briefly touch on before I bring the presentation to an end, and that's the Charities Commission funding. There was a slight increase for our regulator, which is positive news and should put to bed the idea that charities should pay for the regulator. It'd be interesting to see what that money is allocated for in the years ahead. A real confusion around DCMS budgets, and I think the briefing PB you've done has highlighted that nicely. We really don't know what that means for the department, the announcements that were made yesterday. And what confuses things even further is our Home Directorate, Civil Society and Youth. There's no mention of that at all in the budget document. So we don't really know if that's going to see an increase or decrease, even if DCMS's budget is increased, because that could, of course, go to digital connectivity, sport, and the culture sector as well. Again, I think we might hear in the next presentation something on the national living wage increase. Again, positive for the low paid, but doesn't undo the universal credit cut that we've seen. I think just my overall reflections is I think this is quite a disappointing budget for the sector. No real strategic funding, very few mentions, if at all. And the mentions that were included are less than money than was expected. So for the reasons Matt has outlined at the beginning of the presentation, I think we're going to see tough times for charity finances, and there's nothing in this budget suggests that funding from the government will offset that for the moment. So yeah, that's my rather pessimistic take on the budget.
So moving on to Sian, what does this all mean for the people that charities actually serve?
Thanks, Nicola. So we're hearing across the sector, and if you're looking at Twitter, if you're looking at social media, if you're looking at press releases, then most of what I say, you'll have seen reflected in the many charities who are putting out statements in response to the spending review. We're seeing a mixed bag, and there are definite positives coming through in this set of announcements. Of course, we're really pleased to see the increase in minimum wage, because we absolutely know that having a living income, being able to go to work, being able to earn enough money to support yourself and your family is crucial. And so any increase in the minimum wage is really important. But the actual gain to people from the increase that's been announced isn't obviously as large as the figures in the budget, because they're gross, not net. And so the IFS has already done analysis showing that the statement that it's worth about £1,000 to a family in full-time work, actually after tax and national insurance, that £1,000 reduces to about £700 per year. So £700 increase obviously is better than nothing, but it's still not enough to be able to really help the families who need those increases. And anyone who's on universal credit, that actual gain would be less than about £300 a year. So that increase is minimal and will make very little dent in the kinds of costs that people are going to see. And where those costs coming from? Well, we didn't really see those addressed at all in the budget. So the true costs that we're seeing are rises in utility costs, food costs, really basic kind of essential living costs around housing, food, utilities. And of course, every family across the country, no matter what they earn, no matter what their circumstances, have to cover those three costs. And so not addressing those in the spending review is, in our view, quite a significant gap. When we think about the kinds of debt that we're seeing across the country, Toynbee Hall runs a partnership called Debt Free London, which serves people across London who need debt advice. And over the last year, the fastest growing debt sector that we're seeing is in utility bills. So we're seeing 60% increase in electricity arrears. We're seeing 80% increase in gas arrears and 71% increase in water arrears. And to know that those costs are going to keep going up, to know that with the pressure on fuel, the pressure on energy that's coming through the sector, that's going to be passed on to customers, we're going to see those debts increase, and to see nothing that really addresses those issues around living costs for the very, very poorest, again, concerns us. And why do I say that we're not seeing any help in the budget for the very, very poorest? Because none of the support is going to help anyone who's not working. So the cut to universal credit and the increase in minimum wage is not going to help anybody who can't work. And people who can't work are the most vulnerable in our society right now. It does concern us that the rhetoric in this particular budget statement is all around working households, as though somehow choosing to work is a moral choice right now, as opposed to a set of external circumstances beyond our control. So we know, for example, that people who are caring already are struggling to be able to work more than 16 hours a week, because if you're caring and you're working more than 16 hours a week on minimum wage, you immediately lose your carer's allowance. So how can you provide full-time care and work and still earn enough money? You simply can't. The combination of the limits on carer's allowance and the amount of time that you could usefully work and also care means that people who are caring for anyone, whether that's children or whether that's people with adults with a disability or elderly people, the moment you're in that situation, you can't earn enough because of the way that the different pieces of support don't fit together well enough. So we know that no announcement in this budget to increase the earnings limit around carers is a real problem. If you're living with a disability and you can't work, there's no work available for you, or the nature of your disability means it's impossible for you to work, there's no extra support in this budget. And if you have an illness that is stopping you from working, so for example, anyone with a cancer diagnosis who's going to have to go through treatment that will prevent them from working, or the nature of their cancer means that they're going to be unable to work, there's also no help for you in this budget. So whilst there's a lot of support in this announcement for people who are able to work full time on low incomes, and we really welcome that, what we're not seeing is any support for anyone who's got to, because of the circumstances of their life right now and the nature of the job market, who can't work full time. So the Joseph Rowntree Foundation have put out some really, really good analysis quite quickly, thank you as always, to that amazing team, showing that for a single adult with no children who's not able to work right now because there's either no work available or because they have some kind of life circumstance that prevents them from working, they're going to be £13 a week worse off. For a single parent with one child who can only work up to 16 hours a week, they're going to be £8 a week worse off. And for a couple with two children, even with one full-time worker in that household, they're going to be £4 a week worse off. Now, when we think about the living costs that are coming and that have already been hitting families, to say that families on the lowest possible incomes already are going to be worse off under this budget, what does that mean for us and in the charity sector? Well, it means that we're going to have to find even more resource to support even more households who are going to be coming to us with a range of concerns and a range of issues that need help. So they might be struggling to pay their bills, as I've described, utility bills, we're seeing rent increases, we're seeing increased rent arrears. So there's a new fund announced, which, £100 million going to help the impact on financial services. What we really want to see there is innovators in the financial services sector doing some great work thinking about how can they help reduce the poverty premium. So if you're in the financial services sector and you're going to have a windfall from being a challenger bank, what I'd really like you to be thinking about is how could you put your best teams to work on bringing down the poverty premium? How can we help people who are paying for fuel, utilities, including internet, which of course is so important to help families connect, and for school children to be able to do schoolwork, for families to be able to job hunt and to be able to get into the new economy work? How can you help bring down the poverty premium of paying essential bills? We know that there's going to be a £65 million funding package to local authorities to help families with rent arrears. How are you going to get that money out quickly? It's not going to be enough. How are you going to stretch it and make sure that it really helps the most vulnerable families? How are we going to get utility companies to think about really stepping up and thinking about those lowest earning families, those families with disabilities, with caring needs, or families who are going through a traumatic life event such as a cancer diagnosis, worklessness, sudden shock unemployment? How are we going to help those families really manage, keep warm this winter and be able to heat their homes, light their homes and cook safely? So how do we really make sure that the utility sector, working in partnership with the third sector, really target those most vulnerable families? And then when we think about when a family can't pay and is struggling with arrears of some kind, how do we get them to the right kind of debt advice and the right kind of support to prevent evictions, to prevent utilities being switched off? Now, we know that the Money and Pension Service is at the moment making big decisions about how it funds and supports and contracts debt advice. And we really need to make sure that we're protecting the right kind of advice for the most vulnerable. So, you know, watch that space on what the decisions coming out of the Money and Pension Service to support families around access to debt advice. And then our last thinking is around who's already struggling, and we're going to see it even worse. So Macmillan are struggling around access and funding for providing support to people with a cancer diagnosis. How do we make sure that people with a cancer diagnosis or other forms of a diagnosis that is going to really mean that they can't work and they're going to fall into this very, very vulnerable group of people who are not going to get a living wage? So whether you've got a motor neurone disease diagnosis or muscular dystrophy, you know, those organizations who are supporting those families and those families with a new diagnosis, they're going to struggle. So finally, how do we bring all that together? Well, as the charity sector, we're going to be stretched to the limit. You heard already in the previous two presentations that the income to charities is going to be unpredictable. A lot of it is going to depend on the big decisions that trusts and foundations make and local authorities make, because we can't rely on individual giving. But, you know, if you're listening to this and you're one of the people who's benefiting from this budget statement and you think about how you could give back, then think about those charities who are supporting people who are not able to receive any support from this budget and who are actually going to receive a net loss. So that's disabilities, carers, people with a terminal diagnosis, people with a serious diagnosis, and people maybe in the homelessness sector. That's where we're going to need your support most, because those families, those individuals, they're losers and their costs are going to go up, their circumstances are going to continue to be bad, and we're going to have to continue to support them. My final thought is around how we help people into work. At Toynbee Hall, we ran a piece of work across the pandemic called Pandemic Stories. You can find it on our website, where we worked and supported people from across low income and marginalised communities to do their own piece of research around what needs to change so that in a future pandemic, there's not a disproportionate impact on low income families, people with disabilities or people from ethnic minority backgrounds. And one of the really important things they said alongside having a living income is that they need support to be able to get into work. And that support isn't just about the universal credit taper, although that's really helpful. They also need time and space to retrain. And so in the announcement, there's a lot of support for retraining. And what we really need to make sure is that that gets to the households who really need it. And often the households who are furthest away from the workspace find it hardest to engage and hardest to create the safe space and the energy and the kind of cognitive and physical capacity to be able to retrain. And so what we really need to see is a very strong alliance between the organisations like Toynbee Hall and others who are supporting those furthest from the workspace, together with those training funds, so that we can really make sure that there's investment in the communities who want to be able to, for example, work in the green economy, but are furthest from that work right now. Because if we take this opportunity now, we can transform the lives in the future for many, many households. So thinking about what does levelling up mean, it doesn't just mean geographical levelling up, it also means those pockets of communities across the country, in London as well as the regions, who are furthest from the workspace. And how do we make sure that we can support their ambition to be in the workspace, working well, and particularly around the green economy? How can we help those who, for example, right now don't even have internet access, become both skilled and have the tools and resources to be able to work in the digital economy? So there's a lot to do. This is a very mixed budget. The people who have been forgotten are the most vulnerable, And of course, that will mean that there's a huge burden now on the charity and the local authority sector to be able to support those families. Thanks.
Well, thank you to all our panelists for their insights, and we'll now take some questions. I've just got one actually from Rob. Perhaps, Matt, if I could address this to you. Rob asks, what should we take, if anything, from the lack of mention of the social sector by the Chancellor?
I think more than anything, it's a missed opportunity. I think the idea that, and this is probably an idea which is lodged in the heads of some officials and politicians, that what the social sector wants is to be mentioned in budget statements as recipients of things is actually one of the things which sort of like they might push back against a little bit. I think really what certainly I would like to see the social sector elevated in terms of is the help we can provide to the government's own agenda. So to levelling up, to building back better, to securing economic growth. All of those things that the sector does up and down the country, it's not about asking the government, can we have some more money, please? Yes, that would be nice as well. But it's about saying, how can we be involved in delivering a better Britain? And I think the absence of the sector from the documents and from the speech is a missed opportunity for him and for the Treasury. Elsewhere within government, there is an increasing recognition, I think, about the importance of things like social capital, of giving power to communities. And you can see, particularly in the sort of new Levelling Up department, Neil O'Brien and various people there is some sort of shift towards thinking more about how you engage with the sector in order to achieve good outcomes. But clearly there's a bit of a disconnect between what that part of government is saying and what the Treasury is saying. And if we can bridge that, and if we can actually be fully involved in alongside the private sector, alongside the public sector, in delivering the government's agenda, then I think that's the goal we want to be aiming for.
Well, following on from that, there's a point from Claire, and she's saying, thinking about the omission of charities from the announcements, how can we as a sector best influence Treasury policy moving forward, do you think?
So I think the levelling up route is a good one for us to take, and I think the fact that, as I say, there is an ear within government for this sort of thinking. Given that levelling up is so central at the moment to what the government is trying to deliver, I think let's be candid, particularly the Prime Minister, perhaps more so than the Chancellor, then that is the opportunity for us to play a fuller role and to convince skeptics within government that is a good place for us to be. We should be playing that fuller role. I think it's hard to sort of go direct on this. So simply saying to the Treasury, to the Chancellor, hey, what about us guys? I'm not sure that's going to work. We can do it and we should do it, but I'm not sure it's going to work. I think proving our worth through the route that is actually open to us of levelling up is perhaps going to bear more fruit more quickly.
So if anybody else has got comments they'd like to add, then don't forget to obviously use your sort of chat window. You mentioned, Matt, that there's 170 billion of sort of money around from people not spending during the pandemic. How do you think charities can try and tap into some of that? More marketing or what?
Yeah, I mean, I think Richard in particular might have thoughts on this, but I think one of the things that I'd be quite keen on the sector looking into, and maybe this is already going on, certainly not my area of expertise, is a sort of collective, collaborative appeal to people. So rather than being very competitive about it and each charity wanting to sort of run their own campaigns and people end up being bombarded and it sort of becomes white noise in the end, can we have something where actually perhaps some of the larger charities and perhaps sort of nuancing it at the local level are able to say, hey, guess what? It's time to, we've been through all this together. We've had your back. Now it's time for us all to pull together. So much as Sian was just saying, then actually for those who are sort of coming through this, the ones with the 170 billion pounds in their pockets, being able to appeal to them in general to the idea of giving to those causes which have been so important through the pandemic and will continue to be important, after that, I think that's really important, because I'll say that I'm sort of aware I'm sort of hogging the Q&A so far, so I might not get a chance to come back in again. So I'll just say this quickly, which is that my slight fear with the tone of the budget yesterday from the Chancellor, and why I sort of framed it the way I did in my presentation, is this idea of we've turned the corner, this idea of, well, the economy is getting back on track now, and therefore, full steam ahead, everything's okay. And what you do is you then just completely miss the admittedly relatively small number, but non-trivial number of people who are, again, being left behind, of all the people that Sian was talking about, that aren't in work, aren't able to easily find work, who will be the ones that will be damaged by the fact that, yes, unemployment is set to fall, but it's not going to get back to where it was. All of those people who've had to draw on their savings or borrow in order to get through the pandemic, who are now going to be finding utility bills going up and struggling with that. All of those people are perhaps now in the blind spot for the government, because as far as they're concerned, we've turned the corner. And so I think being able to sort of remind people of the importance of our sector in supporting exactly those groups for positive reasons and for sort of crisis management reasons is going to be really important. We need to do that collectively.
Actually, yes, maybe Richard, you could sort of follow up on that, because obviously there was talk of local government spending going up. So how do you think that will physically manifest itself in terms of support for charities from local governments? They've obviously still got a lot of pressure on them from social funding and other things.
Yeah, I mean, worth noting, it may not be actual a real terms increase in spending. I know that the IFS and others have looked at it and suggest that it's not perhaps as clear as was announced. I think the key thing, again, I want to emphasise is that, and Matt sort of touched upon this, I'm less concerned about the institution of charity, which is perhaps odd for me to say given my role, but how it impacts beneficiaries and those least fortunate. And I think an increase in local government spending is really important for that and can be really helpful. And again, going back to comments that have been made, I think a collaborative approach is absolutely crucial with all this stuff. That I think we're starting to see silos breaking down within organisations, within local authority areas and regions. So doing collaborative bidding and other things is really, really important to do that. I mean, it's not going to be a panacea. There's been a slight increase in local government funding, but it's certainly better than was feared. Going back a step as well, I think on the levelling up side, again, it really is a missed opportunity from government not to engage with the social sector when you're looking to tackle things like regional inequality. And again, we need to be more forceful of making the case that we can, as Matt's already said, help with achieve their agenda. And not just put out the begging bowl and ask for additional pots of money. Although again, that would be really nice. So not to poo-poo that idea. So yeah, there's some brief thoughts. It's hard to know exactly what it means at this stage, but certainly better than could have been expected, I think.
Yes, Sian, you mentioned levelling up, and in that context, what do you think about the National Numeracy project that was announced yesterday? Presumably that will help some of those people access the labour market who might not have been able to come in otherwise?
Yeah, I mean, I doubt that there's a direct link between the Numeracy project and getting a job. There are so many more things that stop someone getting a job than not being able to do maths. So I think that it's a really important step forward, and it recognises that there's a gap in our education. And that gap is about numeracy, but it's also about confidence. It's also about literacy. It's also about the fact that there's a natural kind of gap that we're not even talking about here, which is about racial prejudice. And we know that, for example, Runnymede Trust will show us very clearly that there is still a gap between what a young white person has in terms of opportunities versus someone from a BME background. So I think there's a whole range of things that we need to think about. Numeracy is not in itself a panacea, but it is a really important part of the process. I think what that also shows us is, in response to the question, how does the charity sector get heard? That tells us that there's been a really, really strong case made by numeracy charities and numeracy advocates who've been able to get that directly into the budget. And I think what we can see there is that what I think this government responds to really well is identified actions. So rather than theories or rather than kind of generalized statements around, you know, there's a particular problem, please go away and solve it. I think what this government responds really well to is we've identified an issue and we have a solution, and the solution looks like this, the solution costs something like this, and this is how you take it forward. And, you know, I'd give us another example of a piece of work that we've been working on for several years, which is around the idea of a no interest loan scheme pilot. The idea that, you know, if you can enable an individual or a household who, through not being able to access affordable credit, are stuck in some way, and yet being able to access affordable credit would help them move forwards, that there's a case to be made there. And the Treasury are funding a no interest loan scheme pilot in order to test that hypothesis. So I think that when the third sector come along and say, we can see that there's a problem, what we need to also come along with for this particular government is a good solution. And the solution needs to be one that we can be proactive in helping take forward and cost that. The other thing I think that's really important about this is that we're in a time where it's really important not to infantilize people. And it's always been important not to infantilize people, but I think in this particular context right now, that's a really, really important kind of thing to remember. And so when we as the third sector come along and say that there's an issue, I think we're well placed now, but also it's really important to not simply describe people as in need, but to describe people as they truly are, which is highly engaged in their own problem and wanting to be part of the solution. So for example, when we're talking about people who are experiencing disability and therefore can't work, what we mustn't do is describe them as someone who is passive, because, you know, when you talk and work with people who are living with a disability, what they are not is passive about their situation. They're highly engaged. They're highly kind of aware of what they need in terms of support, and also what their personal role is and agency needs to be. And so the more that we as a charity sector can talk about people that we're working with and supporting in that way, bringing their lived experience, really making sure that they're engaged and have agency in designing and developing the solutions themselves, I think two things happen. One, we tell a much truer story than a story of just kind of recipient need rather than recipient kind of engagement. And secondly, I think this particular government, which has a very strong kind of view around people being part of their own solutions, I think they're much more likely to kind of listen to that. So in any work that we're doing as a third sector, thinking about where investment needs to be, we need to make sure that we're bringing the people that we're supporting and working alongside directly into that conversation.
So if I can quickly, butt in for the last question, there's a point I really missed. I think it's really important, and work's been done on that. And that's the one thing we need to influence policy is better data as well. And I know that it's something that the Family Law Commission has looked at. And during the pandemic, we were heard frequently from officials that we need better data on the sector. What's the impact been of the pandemic? And without that, it was difficult to make the case. So in addition to the political will and the influencing and lobbying, we also need that better data as well.
And following on from that, Richard, there's the question here saying sort of higher demand ahead for charities supporting the most vulnerable. Sounds like a grand case of failure demand in the face of government priorities. Is it being tracked? And if not, what would be the best way for charities to track this? So again, like you're saying, we need some sort of hard empirical data about what it is that charities are doing. What are your thoughts on that, Matt?
Sorry, that was
just saying, what are your thoughts on that? Getting some of the hard empirical data on what it is that charities are doing that can obviously then be fed through to government and hopefully influence policy.
No, absolutely. I mean, that's 100% where we are. And for those that haven't already seen it, the Law Family Commission on Civil Society, we published a paper about this time last week on precisely this, which with recommendations for government on how it can work with the sector actually to improve our data collection so that we have a better understanding of what's going on. I know we're sort of running out of time, but just very quickly to say on both on the national numeracy announcement yesterday and on an announcement for funds for early intervention in children's services, both of those were big announcements, perhaps not as big as some would have liked in terms of the children's services, but were on the back of, at least part, some of the work that we had done with some of those charities, which had provided exactly that empirical evidence of the sort of false economy of not investing in those things. So because we've cut spending on early intervention of children's services, we're now spending more on late intervention, which we sort of statutorily have to do. Presenting that in very clear way to the government, suddenly they get it. Now, it doesn't work every time, But we were only able to do that because in that particular instance, we were able to get the data. All the children's charities came together and we worked with them, and we were able to present the data. Similarly, on the numeracy side, we were able to look at the actual the multiplier effect of investing in numeracy skills for adults. And again, that was an argument which the Treasury ultimately then was convinced by. So the more we can get good quality data that allows us to back up the arguments which instinctively we all know are true, for more early intervention, for more prevention, in order to save money further down the line, then the better.
Okay, well, I think that's a great place to stop and finish for today. Obviously, a lot more to consider going forward. Thanks, everybody, for joining us today. You can support PB's valuable work by clicking on the donate button, or sign up to our newsletter to be invited to more events like this and hear about our work. But for now, thank you for joining us, and goodbye.